Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our meeting today of the Public Service Board Select Committee. And welcome to our visitors as well, and to officers. And I think it's probably very helpful for those watching if we could all introduce ourselves. So, first of all, I'm Councillor Jane Pratt, and I represent Llanelli Hill. If I could ask our visitors to introduce themselves, please. It's just, if you could press the red button. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, lovely. Morning all, I'm Sophie Howe and I'm the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales.
Good morning, I'm Chris Margus. I'm seconded from the Fire and Rescue Service into the Future Generations Commissioner's Office, supporting Sophie today.
Morning, Matt Feekins, member for Monmouth.
I'm Martin Grokett, I'm the member for Lansdowne in Abergavenny.
Dimitri Petruni, member for St Christopher's and Chepstow.
Frances Taylor, member for Mega.
Matthew Gatehouse, Head of Policy and Governance.
Hi, I'm Rhianne Cook. I'm the Engagement and Communications Officer.
I'm Sian Schofield from the Policy and Performance team.
Richard Jones from the Policy and Performance team.
Good morning, I'm Sharon Lloyd. I'm the Community and Partnerships Manager for Monmouthshire.
And I'm Hazel Clatworthy, Sustainability Policy Officer for the Council.
Thank you all very much indeed, and we would like to extend a warm welcome to you. Thank you very much for coming along today, and we understand that you have a very busy schedule, so we really do appreciate it. And we are actually going to take the opportunity. I understand you've got other things to go on to, so we've brought your slot in the agenda to our first item. Okay, fine. So to elect a chair, do we need to formally do that, Paula?
No, Councillor Pratt, as the chair of the PSB, has a revolving chair from our other 4 select committees. County Councillor Pratt is the chair of our Strong Communities Select Committee, so it's her turn to chair this morning, so it's your meeting, Chair.
Thank you. Do we have any apologies for our absence?
Yes, Chair, we've received apologies this morning from County Councillors Howarth, Pavia and Treharne.
Thank you very much. And agenda item 4, the public open forum. Do we have any members of the public present? So we'll move straight on, and obviously if we're very lucky to have Sophie with us, and if you'd like to speak to the committee, Sophie. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I was asked to give a bit of a brief overview in terms of my vision for the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. I'm assuming that most of you will have heard of it, may not know it in depth, so I'll give a little bit of an overview of what the Act requires, the way in which I'm sort of pursuing my role, and perhaps a little bit of insight into where we think Monmouthshire PSB is to date in terms of how they're developing their work around the Act. So the Act was passed in 2015. It's regarded as internationally groundbreaking. The reason for that is that there's no other country in the world that has put quite the same form around a statutory definition of sustainable development. There are other places in the world that have similar pieces of legislation, but not as all-encompassing as ours, and I'll give you some of the reasons for that in a moment. I think until perhaps we'd put a statutory definition around sustainable development within this legislation in Wales, sustainable development had been regarded perhaps as, if you ask the average person on the street, they would probably tell you it's something to do with the environment. They wouldn't necessarily think it was very much broader than that, perhaps something that only got talked about kind of within the bowels of the UN or something along those lines. But actually, our statutory definition of sustainable development is about improving the social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being of Wales. And Wales is quite different there as well, because cultural well-being doesn't feature anywhere else in the world in terms of the definition of sustainable development. The legislation then also puts in place, mechanisms for us to get there. So sets out 5 ways of working that now need to be adopted by the 44 public bodies in Wales. I say now need to be adopted. They probably, should have been adopted a long time ago. If you've been around in the public sector, you will know that collaboration, for example, has been a buzzword for very many years. Whether we are actually genuinely collaborating with each other, delivering one public service in Wales is highly questionable. But collaboration is one of those key 5 ways of working or sustainable development principles as set out in the legislation. There's also then planning for the long term, which again, I generally don't think we've been that good at doing in the public sector in Wales. All sorts of reasons for that: short-term political cycles, budget cycles, short-term performance measures, and so on. But this statutory duty now on all public services, including politicians, obviously, who take decisions within them, to look beyond the next election cycle and start setting out this and working towards a kind of long-term vision, and actually recognising the long-term and future trends that are coming our way. And again, I think that's a particular area which the private sector are probably a lot better than the public sector have been here in Wales and indeed further afield. So planning for the long term, collaborating, so working with each other in the public sector amongst different bodies and more broadly. Preventing problems from occurring or from getting worse, again, an area that has been spoken about a lot, but whether we ever actually get to addressing the root cause of issues is questionable. If you look at some of the things, and health service is always quite a good one to look at here. They will talk about a shift to prevention. Probably what they're talking about are things like increasing spend on smoking cessation and the likes. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. Of course, that's a good thing. But actually, that's probably secondary prevention. And what the Act requires is for us to be looking at the root cause. So what are the links between people starting to smoke in the first place, poverty, family circumstances and the likes, and how do we get right up front of a problem rather than having to deal with the problem after it's already occurred. And then integration, so recognising that no one issue, challenge or solution exists in isolation, and that they have knock-on effects to each other. There's also an important point on integration, that the duty within the legislation is to be, as I said, improving the social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being of Wales. So when we're taking decisions now, the legislation requires us to understand the impacts on each of those different pillars of well-being, and we shouldn't be in a position where one pillar of well-being is trumping another one, if you like. And then the final way of working within the legislation is involvement. So that's involving people who are affected by decisions in that decision-making process. I say quite regularly, there's not a kind of hierarchy of the ways of working within the legislation, but if I had to choose one, I would probably put involvement somewhere near to the top, because I think if you ask the public, which is elected members, you do regularly, I'm sure, what they will tell you is that they're genuinely concerned about the long-term prospects for their children and their grandchildren, so they want public policy to be better thinking about the long term. They'll tell you that they're not interested in your service boundaries or your geographical boundaries. They don't exist in a nice neat box requiring social services intervention or health intervention or education support, that actually they want to be looked at kind of holistically, so they want you to be collaborating together. They'll tell you that if you're spending taxpayers' money, that they want you to get biggest bang for the buck. So if we're spending in one area, how can we have knock-on benefits in other areas? And they'll also tell you, I think, that they would like help for help to ensure that problems don't occur in the first place. So that's prevention. So I think that involvement part is crucial. It's something that we often only look at in terms of kind of public consultation and engagement. And to give you a kind of flavour of that, the Welsh Government a couple of years ago, I haven't counted it since because feels like some sort of torture, but the Welsh Government, I think, did something like 742 consultations in 1 year. How many real people actually responded to those consultations? I would imagine it was very few. How many of the responses to those consultations actually gave any insight into the real lives that people are leading, and therefore the solutions that we need to be finding to help them in public policy terms? Again, I I would imagine that it's not very many. So I think involvement has got to go further than just public consultations. We need to be looking at mechanisms for us to understand the lives that people are leading and to adopt and develop policy on that basis. So those are the 5 sustainable development principles within the legislation. And then there are also 7 national wellbeing goals. I'm sure you've got the sort of paperwork in front of you, so I won't speak to each of them. But essentially, they set out a vision for the Wales that we want to see. And the legislation places a statutory duty on 44 public bodies. All of our local authorities, our health boards, some of our national bodies, Natural Resources Wales, Sport Wales and the like, and significantly Welsh Government as well, to work within this legislation and to set objectives which maximise their contribution to the 7 national wellbeing goals. They also establish, as you know, public services boards, which I suppose is the formal kind of governance mechanism for bringing all of the key services in one local authority area together to work out where are those areas where there really needs to be joint solutions to particular problems. And the first 2 years of the legislation has really been into, I suppose, looking at the sort of process that we need to follow, or that those PSBs and public bodies need to follow to set objectives, to undertake wellbeing assessments, which I'm assuming you will have scrutinised at some point, and to set a wellbeing plan. And we're now at the stage where most of the draft wellbeing plans, all of the draft wellbeing plans are out there for consultation and scrutiny by myself, by yourselves as well. And I've given some advice in terms of the Monmouthshire draft wellbeing plan, which I'm assuming you will have seen that advice. But perhaps I could just pick out a few areas that I think perhaps we need to be focusing on. I also gave advice on the Monmouthshire Wellbeing Assessment, which was done last year, and released an overarching report drawing and learning lessons from wellbeing assessments across each of the 19 public services boards across Wales. And just as an overview of some of the issues that I think we need to be focusing on, this is general rather than specific to Monmouthshire, but the PSBs need to be much more than just the coming together of leaders from each different public service to update each other on what they've done over the last month or so. PSBs need to be demonstrating that they are thinking, planning, and then increasingly delivering services together in terms of this model of one public service in Wales. What we found from our study of the wellbeing assessments is that that wasn't always happening. Sometimes they were being run as another local authority committee. They weren't necessarily inviting the right people along. There are some statutory invitees, but there are others at the discretion of the PSB who can be brought along. And in some PSBs, we felt people were just turning up and going through the motions and having agendas which were, 20 items long, sat in a room having a series of presentations and not actually getting down into the real nub of the kind of contentious, and some of these issues are very contentious, discussions that need to take place. So from a perspective of those who are scrutinising the actions of the PSB, I think that it's really important that you're looking at, exactly how the PSB is operating and whether those sorts of discussions are taking place that get us to, okay, what is the root cause of the issues that we're trying to solve here? Who is best placed to address that root cause? Do we understand as a PSB the long-term trends on any particular issue that we're considering coming our way? And are we genuinely integrating solutions and collaborating around solutions, or are we just carrying on doing what we've already done and coming along and giving an update of what that might be? And so I think there's some real big issues for all PSBs in that. We identified that the PSBs were not necessarily where we would want them to be in terms of making links with other key statutory committees, organisations and plans. So, for example, a number of the wellbeing assessments didn't really recognise the importance of, for example, local development plans, which will actually be crucial to a number of the objectives that they are now setting. Very many of them in this region didn't actually reference anything to do with the city deal, which is a bit worrying given, it's a major plank of economic development plans within the region. And links between the regional committees which have been established through the Social Services and Wellbeing Act. Again, clear links need to be made there. Almost every PSB in Wales, for example, has some objective, and you have one here around giving every child the best start in life. So if if that's your objective, you need to be really clear about what's going on in those regional partnership boards, which are the boards with statutory responsibility around safeguarding and planning and delivering on social services. So we need to be seeing a clear integration there. I was pleased to see in your draft, or in the Monmouthshire draft wellbeing plan, that you've at least kind of mapped that out and are showing the connections in that sort of family tree, if you like, of various committees and governance structures. So that is good. And then the final area for every PSB really is we need to get better at identifying long-term trends. And the Welsh Government, you may be aware, have produced a Future Trends report. It's, I would say, a work in progress. I'm really pleased to see that in Monmouthshire you've got the Monmouthshire Futures work ongoing, and that it is an area that you've identified that you need to build on your sort of capability, if you like. And then I guess more specifically in terms of the Monmouthshire wellbeing assessment, we recognised that there was some really good engagement with the public, really proactively, officials getting out there and putting in place mechanisms to draw in the views of the public, and that came through in both what we recognised as good quality quantitative and qualitative data. Some PSBs, they gave you a whole raft of stats, but they actually weren't backing that up with any of the, so what's actually really going on in this particular community, and what does, if you're a person with these particular characteristics, what does life feel like for you? That was quite a strong part of the Monmouthshire wellbeing assessment. We were also really pleased to see that there was an identification of assets within the community as well as challenges. Again, I think we can get too sort of stuck in the mire of, it's all terrible. We've got all these challenges ahead. We've got no money. All of that, of course, is true. But actually, we have a lot of assets as well. And one of the key assets that have been identified in Monmouthshire and indeed in other areas was, community spirit, volunteering, and that kind of community cohesion, if you like. And that is a really, really important asset upon which to build. And I think public services ignore that as an asset at their peril, because they will need that sort of community cohesion, spirit, volunteering and so on to try and address some of the challenges that they've got going forward in the absence of any new glug of public funding coming into the system. I was pleased to see as well that Monmouthshire worked as part of the GSWAG group. I always think it sounds like something that should be some sort of gangster rapper, but it stands for Gwent Strategic Wellbeing Assessment Group. So that was coming together with the other public service boards in the Gwent area to learn lessons from each other and to plan and deliver their wellbeing assessment together. So that was a good piece of collaborative working. I think where we want to see more work, however, and this has been recognised in what you've said in your wellbeing assessment and in the draft plan, is that we do need to give more consideration to the points of prevention. So we've identified the challenges, we've done reasonably well at identifying the kind of, some of the lived experiences of people. We're coming together and collaborating with others. What that now needs to move to is where is the right point of prevention. So if you take, for example, one of your draft wellbeing objectives in your wellbeing plan, giving every child the best start in life, who needs to do what to give every child the best start in life? If you take, for example, adverse childhood experiences, which are identified as one of the areas that you should focus on within your draft wellbeing plan, adverse childhood experiences services are defined as a child growing up in a household where there's domestic abuse, substance misuse, mental health problems, parental separation or incarceration. And 14% of the Welsh population have experienced 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences. And for those young people, when they move into adulthood, they are 20 times more likely to end up in prison. They're 6 times more likely to have a teenage pregnancy. They're 15 times more likely to be the perpetrator or victim of violence. So in other words, they're considerably more likely on every level to end up as the adults who are ending up in our public services and increasing our demand. Now, what do we need to do to prevent that? So to me, that talks to integration. That talks about what are we doing at an early phase to be intervening effectively and appropriately in terms of domestic abuse. What does that mean in terms of how we fund and commission domestic abuse services? What does that mean in terms of this other committee which exists over there? It's called the Area Planning Board. It commissions substance misuse services. How well are they responding to actually preventing adverse childhood experiences? Or are they just dealing with the adult in front of them? How well are mental health services also responding to tackling adverse childhood experiences, both in terms of recognising perhaps mum or dad in front of them and the impact that mum or dad with a mental health issue might be having in terms of ACEs on children, but also how well are our CAMs responding to some of those early signs of mental health issues. And I think it was your wellbeing assessment actually that identified that most enduring mental health conditions for people as they move into adulthood actually start before the age of 14. So if we're looking at preventing these problems from occurring, we need to be getting much further upstream in terms of some of the issues that we're looking at, and we need to be getting much better at integrating those services. So big focus needed on prevention. Coming on to your plan, and then I will stop and very happy to take any questions. I think that the priorities that you've set out, or the PSB have set out in the wellbeing plan, are sensible. I don't have any issues with them. As I said, the statutory duty is for those objectives or those priorities to maximise the contribution to each of the 7 wellbeing goals, and the plan sets out where those connections are. What I think you do need to focus on is integration between each of the priorities. So you've got one of your priorities on young people. And how does that link to your other objectives? So you've got priorities on young people, older people, on the environment and on the economy. So if we think just about the integration and the link between the priorities you have on young people and the priorities you have on older people. So we're talking about building resilience amongst young people. We're talking about adverse childhood experiences. We're talking about keeping every child healthy and active. Links to old people, well, we're also talking about loneliness, we're talking about seeing them as an asset. There are opportunities, I think, to be thinking about how do we use that asset of older people in our community to actually help build resilience within our young people. When I talked about ACEs earlier, there's really clear evidence that of the importance of a trusted adult or a number of trusted adults in a child's life in terms of that person providing resilience from adverse childhood experiences which might be going on in that child's life. And so if we're able to bring those, you can see opportunities where you could bring those two things together to both, provide volunteering opportunities for older people, which would help to build resilience in younger people. That's where we're seeing the integration between the two priorities in your plan. Likewise, the plan talks about active travel. It talks about enhancing the natural environment. Well, if we have a priority around increasing opportunities for physical activity for children and young people, there's a clear link there between access to public open space, how well that public open space is used for physical activity, and whether we're actually keeping our children healthy and active in the first place. Likewise, if we're thinking about children having the best start in life, when we're looking at environment, there in other parts of the world, I haven't seen in other parts of Wales, sorry. I haven't seen this in particular in terms of Monmouthshire, but there are very clear correlations between areas of high poverty and areas of high air pollution. So how are we making those links with, for example, the priorities that you've got around increasing renewable energy? How is that actually also going to help in terms of giving every child the best start in life? So what I'm trying to get to is that we need to be looking at all of these things in an integrated way, back to one of the 5 ways of working within the legislation. And if we fail to do that, we will be missing opportunities to actually take the steps that are necessary to meet the objectives that we've set. And I think the final thing that I want to say is, in terms of how you go about scrutinising this piece of legislation, which people, have described as, it's too all-encompassing, it's kind of amorphous. How do you pin it down? I think those 5 ways of working give you some really clear ways of pinning it down in terms of how you're scrutinising. So I would expect, members of scrutiny to be asking some really key questions about what long-term trends have you considered in relation to this particular issue. How, for example, if we're going to develop the local economy, which is another one of your priorities, are you anticipating what the impact of automation may be? Do you need to do further work in terms of what the impact and opportunities of automation might be in this particular local economy, or can you be drawing from national information and evidence around that? On to prevention, I've talked about that. Where is the root cause? What is the root cause of the issue that we're trying to deal with, and therefore who is best placed to intervene and tackle that root cause? How well are public bodies collaborating together? So again, this concept of one public service, we really need to be moving towards that. And from what I can see in a number of areas, there is resistance to that. There's a really good example of one public service which was established by Gwent Police to deal with the issue of missing children. It's called the Missing Persons Hub, where all public services have come together to, essentially it's a kind of safeguarding issue. You've had children going missing upwards of 300 times, and public services respond by calling the police, and the police pick the children up and they take the children back to their care home or to their parents, and then they go missing the following night, and you just go round in this cyclical nonsense of nobody ever addressing the issue. All of the key public services have come together in one hub so that they have better information and intelligence. They've brought in the third sector to work directly with the children, and the children are now disclosing information to them which they wouldn't have previously disclosed to the police or to social services, and the number of missing children incidents has dramatically reduced just by bringing all of those public services together. Now you can imagine if we did that across the whole gamut of safeguarding services, what the potential impact could be. So I would like to see scrutiny providing some real challenge to members of the public services boards in terms of how they are coming together in those sorts of ways. I also think that scrutiny needs to encourage public services to pause and look for opportunities to maximise the impact, whether that's on a major infrastructure programme or whether that's on the delivery or redesign of a public service. And just to give you a kind of flavour of what I'm talking about here, my last role was in the police service in South Wales. We were we needed a new vehicle maintenance facility, and we went to our neighbouring force. Gwent, do you need to have a new vehicle maintenance facility as well? No, they'd already done something. So we were about to go off and build a new vehicle maintenance facility. It was going to cost about £3.5 million, and we were going to staff it in the normal way. But then we thought, well, actually, we do police cars, but Bridgend Council on our doorstep do refuse trucks. Is there an opportunity for actually bringing those together? That's what we did. We brought them together. We saved each organisation £2 million in capital costs and around about 300,000 in ongoing revenue costs of running that facility. Because we brought them together, we were able to increase the number of apprenticeships we brought into that system. So in lots of ways, what's not to love about that scenario, except if we had paused, if we had worked through each of the wellbeing goals, and this was before the Act, but if now we were doing that and we'd worked through each of the wellbeing goals, we were building a new facility, Could we have powered that facility by renewables? Yes, absolutely, we could have powered that facility by renewables. Nobody thought about it. If we were powering it by renewables, could we have set up a community energy scheme which would have also powered or provided renewable energy power at a lower cost to the SMEs that were on the same business park that we had our facility? Yes, we could have done that. We didn't think about it. If we were having apprenticeships in this vehicle maintenance facility, thinking about the sorts of young people who come onto the books of the criminal justice system, those who are generally not in work, education or training, could we have targeted those people to bring them in as apprenticeships, to get, to engage them in good quality work with opportunities which were more likely to mean that they weren't going to be on our books in the future? Yes, we could have done that. We didn't think about it. Could we have recognised that a number of public bodies were shutting down community facilities in the area, and whilst we were building this facility, could we have put the police station or the community centre or whatever on the on one side of it? Yes, we could. We didn't think about it. What I'm saying is, if we start thinking across each of those 7 wellbeing goals when we're planning and delivering public services or infrastructure programmes, there are ways that we can maximise the benefits across a number of goals, rather than getting drawn into a process. I need a vehicle maintenance facility. I'm going to go through my procurement process. This is how we do it, and this is the kind of box, singular box that we will deliver at the end of it. So I guess my big plea to you is to be really challenging the PSBs on what more they can do, what opportunities there are out there, who they're bringing in to share with them, the unusual suspects who might give you ideas about things that you've never previously heard of, to identify those opportunities. And I think that's the real power of what you can do in terms of scrutiny. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sophie, for that very comprehensive insight into your work. And I'm sure that members have questions for you. So if I could ask Councillor Feakins first.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Sophie, for coming in. We in Monmouthshire have done a huge amount of work to bring this to the table, massive amount of work. And a lot of work's gone into a community council level and town and community councils. It's about integration, it's about alignment of services. And I think there's still a bit of confusion, I think, from the ground up of where the PSB sits within the sort of county council structure and Gwent and those sorts of things. But just to put it back to you, because we don't get the opportunity to put these back into your court very often, so I'm going to put it back to you, if I may, is that these feeds back into a legislative layer, if you like, whereby we want more renewables, for argument's sake. We know that renewables is a good way forward. That is sustainable, and we're looking for a sustainable future. And yet we're charging business rates on hydro schemes to such a high level that they become non-viable. We've got more water in Wales than anything else. We're world famous for water, so we could easily walk down a path of having hydro schemes to power not just all of our own energy in Wales, but also a significant export for the country as well. So that's a legislative thing which we could start at, and that would enable a direction of travel for PSBs and county councils. We in Monmouthshire are very fortunate to have the Brecon Beacons National Park right next to us. They're not involved in our PSB at present. They are involved with Powers, and they've got an input into Powers. 15% of our population live in that national park, and yet their strategic, their legislative purpose doesn't include the word economic, and yet we're looking for an economic, sustainable future. So I think we need to address that, to give the tools back to the national park to enable them to deliver what we want to deliver for our residents. Otherwise, we're going to have 15% of our residents who are going to be held behind an iron curtain if we're not careful. So I think that's something we need to look at. We in Monmouth Town, just bringing it back to very home to where I live, we've got the A40 comes, or the dual carriageway which links us back through to the UK, back to England, and we know that that's a noise and pollution issue. And so, we're talking about well-being of future generations. We're talking about children's play areas, and we've got our village green is right next to the A4, right next to the dual carriageway. Welsh Government again should be looking at helping us as a town, helping us as a county to prevent and to do put things in place, sound and pollution barriers, for argument's sake, locally, so that we're all on the same page. And so really, for me, it's putting it back to you to say that we are doing a lot of work here on the ground, and we're delivering this up from the ground. But also, we need Welsh Government to step back down as well, because it's no good us just saying that this is, if we want to safeguard our future generations and safeguard our children's health and well-being, if we've got the dual carriage over next to it, and we know that's on your red list of pollution areas, so we need Welsh Government to step down and say, well, this is what we're willing to do. And I know that we're in austerity, and I know that we've got budget constraints, but for me, I think there's things, very small, simple things that from a legislative point of view, that Welsh Government could do to assist us to deliver a better future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Feakins. Sophie, if you'd like to respond.
Yeah, absolutely. So I absolutely agree with you. So I'm independent of Welsh Government, so I don't, not part of Welsh Government. Actually, on the hydro scheme, I have, on the issue with business rates on hydro schemes more generally, I have actually raised that with officials, and I know that there is some work going on to look at what might be able to be done about that. But what I do see that you've given 3 examples there, and I bet every member could probably give you another 3, and I could probably give you another 33 examples where other pieces of legislation are knocking against, if you like, the aspirations of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So we're not going to be able to solve all of those in kind of one fell swoop, and the Welsh Government have their own challenges, I shall say no more than that, in terms of their approach to actually implementing the legislation as well. I, previously worked in Welsh Government a number of years ago, and I've also been a local authority councillor and now in this role. And I actually think that most of the really sensible solutions that come from public, in terms of public policy in Wales, don't necessarily come from a Welsh Government level. They actually come from the other public services who are closer to the delivery end. So what I would really encourage you to do is to be, and I'm not saying you are doing this, but don't hold your hands up and say it's the legislative framework, we can't do anything about it. What I think we need to be doing, and I will be the first person to support you in doing that, is saying, right, what needs to happen is X, Y or Z, here's a solution to it. This solution is important because without this solution we have some barriers in terms of how we're implementing the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which Welsh Government you also have duties to comply with. And let's have a sensible conversation about how we're actually going to do that. And as Commissioner, I see my role, I can't intervene in every single issue, but I do see it as my role as where those sorts of solutions and those sorts of dialogues are taking place and where those barriers are identified, of actually getting in behind you and saying, actually, we need to be doing something about this, and using, the powers that I have, softer or harder powers in terms of making that case to Welsh Government, if indeed it's Welsh Government that's the issue. We've been doing something similar just as a bit of a test actually in Anglesey, where the issue is actually the National Grid, who are not covered by the legislation, but we've been working with them to try to get the National Grid into the right place so that what Anglesey Council want to do in terms of meeting their aspirations for the Future Generations Act is not blocked by what the National Grid want to do. And we're seeing some movement there, even from a body that's not covered by the legislation. So please do let me know of examples, and I am more than willing to help wherever I can to push those forward.
Thank you very much. Do you want to come back at all, Councillor Feakins?
Thank you.
Thank you. If I could take the next question from Councillor Grocott.
Thank you very much for coming, Sophie. The Happiness Pulse appeared on the web last week, and I took it. And lo and behold, I am a happy bunny. But that's probably more than can be said for many of the people who I represent in my ward, where 42% of the kids are entitled to free school meals in their local primary school, where there's emerging evidence of considerable amount of domestic abuse and violence within the community, huge housing and social need because there is no affordable housing in North Monmouthshire. I think that I was new to the council in May, and colleagues who've been here longer than I have will probably think, oh my God, has any just thought of this? But it seems to me that the problems of my ward are more typical of the problems of South Wales generally than they are of the problems of Monmouthshire. And indeed in this chamber, those of us who are in the Labour Party are forever being told how lucky we all are to live in such a wonderful, favoured part of the country. I was just wondering, from your experience, are the problems that I face in my ward and Dimitri in his ward similarly typical of those of Wales? And if they are, how is Monmouthshire appearing to you in your role, having looked at all the plans across the whole of Wales? How is Monmouthshire shaping up in terms of the effectiveness of its plan? And will those plans actually lead to change where you have pockets of communities that are very different to the majority populations?
It's a really good question. So in terms of how Monmouthshire's plan looks and the work that Monmouthshire has done so far with wellbeing assessments and so on. So I would say that Monmouthshire are in the kind of top quartile of public service boards in terms of the work that they've done so far. And actually, Chris and I were talking on the way up here, and he gave me a football analogy, which I would otherwise not have known of, which was essentially, they've done really well in the pre-season friendlies, but now they're getting on to the actual real competition. So actually delivering, the proof of the pudding is going to be in how we actually deliver now. I don't think Monmouthshire are in a different place as compared to others, and in fact what they've set out in their plans so far is possibly more detailed than some of the other wellbeing plans that we've seen. Better takes into account future trends. I think there's still challenges, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of getting to integrated thinking. That's not uncommon to a number of public service boards as well. The actual priorities that are in the draft wellbeing plan are also not hugely different. Perhaps a different slant on the priorities around the economy, because obviously the sort of context is different. But picking up on the issues that you talked about within your own ward, this concept of giving every child the best start in life, and what are the issues therefore that we would need to tackle there, that is coming through very clearly in terms of Monmouthshire. Now, there are other parts of Wales where I think the arrangements in terms of doing that are perhaps more sophisticated. And if I could give you Cwm Taf as an example. So Cwm Taf is, and this is something to think about as well, where two public service boards have come together to form one, which I think is eminently sensible. So it's Merthyr and Rhondda and Taf. So if you take some of those issues, such as domestic abuse, such as substance misuse, and all of those sorts of things, the Cwm Taf area actually has the highest prevalence of domestic abuse of anywhere in the UK, or at least is in the top 3 still. So you would certainly you would expect to see arrangements for dealing with those sorts of things well advanced already. And we're seeing that in Cwm Taf. So for example, big focus on domestic abuse, big focus on multi-agency safeguarding hubs for earlier intervention, and so on. So I think Monmouthshire is saying the right things in terms of identifying the issues within their wellbeing plans. I'm actually encouraged, not too worried about the fact that the narrative around what they now do in terms of steps that they're taking, they're not immediately jumping to a we've got a solution. And let me just give you a little bit of a scenario there. There was some work commissioned in Leeds by an organisation called Social Finance, looking at the issue of NEETs, children not in education or training. And generally the approach that public services and public policy has taken to NEETs is, the problem with NEETs is that they don't have 5 good GCSEs. So therefore the answer is invest in, additional, support in schools and so on, and focus on these particular group of children. Actually, actually, when they dug beneath the surface, what they identified is the most significant factor in children being neat is the fact that they'd come into contact with social services at some point during their childhood. So it's not the fact that they weren't, academically able. It's the fact that something else has been going on in their lives which we haven't recognised or addressed. And our whole system at the moment is geared around wait until a problem becomes a real problem before we do anything. So we now need to be shifting that kind of intervention. And I think if Monmouthshire get it right in terms of that shift into that earlier intervention, in terms of probably the issues that are going on for the 42% of young people who are on free school meals, not all of them, but I'm sure there will be factors with some of them, then I think that's the sort of thing that is likely to make change. As I said, I think it's right that they pause and, as I said, start thinking about, okay, as a collective of public services, what is the root cause of this issue and what do we need to do, instead of saying, right, we've now got a plan, here's 15 actions that we're going to take, which are probably the same actions we've been taking for the last 20 years and haven't worked. So, but that's where I think your role in terms of scrutiny can really help to shape that and be prodding that in the right direction.
Thank you. Do you want to come back at all, Councillor Grocott? Are there any other questions from members? Councillor Prituni.
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Sophie. I'm sorry, this is what I'm normally like. I've heard this all before. Lovely words, nothing new. Prevention, yeah, been around for decades. So I'm left uninspired, to be honest. And Monmouthshire particularly is wonderful at words, it's wonderful at rhetoric, and absolutely terrible at delivery. And bizarrely in the plan we talk about best start in life, and in that point it's not bizarre. But in Monmouthshire, actually, in primary level, we deliver really well, even for free school meal pupils. The gap is really minuscule in terms of results. It's like the highest in, I think, in Wales in primary school results. And then you get to secondary school, and then the gap's the worst in Wales. And I think it's pretty sure the worst in England, 44% inequality gap. Something happens at year 7. We don't know, they don't know, I've asked a million times. And so Monmouthshire is actually slightly bizarre. It's the flip of the normal way of things happen. You see it earlier on, and then it sort of deteriorates as we get to GCSE. So GCSE is the key one, highest gap. So I just wonder your thoughts on that, on different problems than the norm. And I appreciate I have the role in this and holding them to deliver, but any other ways of really holding these boards to deliver actually on measurable, identifiably measurable measures to deliver some of this stuff, because the words are just so easy. They're just too easy, in fact. And the other thing is, I'm really keen on 2 other points. One is integration with the city deal and how that all links in the governance structures. I know they're looking to appoint a chief executive in effect to deliver on some of the projects they want to deliver. Have you any discussions about how that'll integrate with all the public services boards? And secondly, conflict between the pillars. I think you sort of touched upon this. But I know you're passionate against the M4. But M4, I'm just using it as a totemic example because I know Francis and I disagree on this. But one of the pillars is, I would argue, is it would be more prosperous for Wales. The other side, and I could see it, effect on health, pollution, and all the rest of that. Those pillars, how do we balance the conflict? I know it is ultimately a compromise in the end, but a more kind of definitive way of how we balance that up would be great.
Okay, so on your attainment, and I'm assuming you're talking about attainment gap rather, or are you talking more broadly? Right, okay, so attainment gap. I mean, that, I don't have the answer to that. I don't know exactly what's going on here in Monmouthshire, but if that's the issue, then that you've identified, and it should be identified in the plan, and you should be commissioning further work to work out what is actually going on there. Why is it at that point? I mean, you know, from my reasonably limited knowledge in terms of, you know, child psychology and the approach that, you know, the key points in children's lives, it's, you know, before age 5, and then there's another kind of key part, which I think is between kind of age 10 and 14. So that might well explain, you know, that sort of age period that needs further looking at. And again, I mean, I would say that this is your opportunity now. You're scrutinising the draft wellbeing plan, and if that's not reflected in there fully enough, and it's a clearly identified issue, then you know, as a member of scrutiny, I would be asking, well, you know, why not, and what is it that we're going to do about it? In terms of identifiable measures, this is a really difficult one because we've got the 46 national indicators which are attached to the legislation. My own view on that is that 46 are too many, and that there should be a few headline indicators because, you know, I don't think people can follow really the 46 indicators. In other parts of the world, they tend to have, you know, 5 key measures and then a suite of indicators beneath them, because the 46 just taken on their own aren't actually going to deliver against the 7 wellbeing goals in their totality either. So I'd rather see a smaller number of really high level measures and then a suite beneath them. The real problematic thing that we've got is the kind of integrated nature of them. So, you know, you can measure, if, for example, we measured, you know, a reduction in carbon emissions on its own, and we had a target for a reduction in carbon emissions. There are certain parts of Wales where if you closed, you know, key plants or factories, that you would meet that carbon emissions target like that. That wouldn't necessarily be the right thing to do, because you'd also be making a number of people unemployed and so on. So I think you've got to be really careful with very narrow measures. I'm doing some work with Cardiff University actually on exactly this. How do we measure in an integrated way the kind of concepts of public value within the Act? And it's not just us that's grappling with it. Across the world, they haven't managed to do that. So I don't have a clear answer for you on very specific measures. Have we achieved it? Haven't we achieved it? Because I think you need to look at things in a suite, but we are doing further work on that. And then you asked about integration and the city deal. It has been an area of concern for me. I have written on a number of occasions and recently attended the joint cabinet of the city deal. My concerns were centred around the fact that this is a major economic development programme that clearly constituent parts of it, except the UK government, all constituent parts of it are covered by statutory obligations under the Future Generations Act, and I could see no evidence that they were actually meeting those statutory obligations to the point that they'd got to so far. What I have said is that I don't want to be in a position where my first statutory review has to be on the city deal. I think that's a point that has been accepted, and we're now working very closely with the programme office with a framework that we have developed, which is essentially a kind of series of prompt questions around each of the goals. Have you considered this? Have you considered this? How can you evidence that? And so on. The balance with that is I don't want to get into a kind of tick box compliance thing, and that's where I think again scrutiny has a real role in asking the right questions and sort of and digging deeper. But on the city deal, that is something that I will and my office will be doing. I think there are some ongoing challenges around the governance with city deals, and I mentioned that in terms of the governance of other committees, statutory or otherwise, and I think in the wellbeing plans that are being developed, we need to see really clear links to those. The city deal is referenced in the draft wellbeing plan, but again, I think there's a role for you in scrutinising. So, what exactly is that looking like in terms of those, in terms of how integrated it is? I'd like to hope that we might see a little bit more coherence and sense coming to that when the new chief exec, I think they're going to be called, is it chief exec or director, is appointed. But I would see you would have a clear role in that scrutiny. And then finally, you asked about the conflicts between different pillars of wellbeing. I mean, really, I can only revert back to what the statute says, which is the duty is to improve the social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being of Wales. So to me, anything which has a detriment to one pillar, which cannot be mitigated, that's a key part as well, is not compliant with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So it's not out of order to have, say, one pillar that is doing really, really well through a particular intervention policy programme and another which is not doing so well. But what is not in order is to have one pillar which is doing really, really well and another one which is doing has a really negative impact. So the duty is to the key word there is to improve the social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being of Wales. And if you've seen my evidence on the M4 inquiry, I say that those policies or programmes which don't meet that should be disregarded.
Thank you very much for that. Just two follow-up on questions. One is just a quick one about, you said you're working with Cardiff University. Is there a timeline to that of when we could expect some of those initial work?
I haven't got a timeline yet. We're just planning what the work is going to look like, and we're looking to kind of model it out in a particular area, which at the moment looks like we're going to be looking at jobs and skills for the future. What would a public value approach and measurement tool on jobs and skills for the future, taking into account all of the other well-being goals, what would that actually look like? So I would say probably it's going to be at least a year's worth of work, because it's really complex.
Year's worth. And the last one, I'll leave you on a provocative note. Does the Wellbeing Future Generation Act effectively mean no more major infrastructure projects will go ahead?
No.
Thank you very much. Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Sophie. Thank you for being with us today. It's really interesting to hear your overview. A couple of questions, probably two particular ones, and then one kind of, I suppose, reflection. In terms of what we're asked to do in terms of the Monmouthshire plan, we're asked to give a view around whether this provides a very clear and concise method or framework, I suppose, to allow those public bodies involved in the PSB to basically take action on the identified areas. From my point of view, when I read the plan, whilst based on the evidence that we have, as you quite rightly say, many of the items seem to be very logical and sensible. I struggle with having enough information in the plan as we have it to know whether that provides a clear framework. I feel that I would need to see all the work that's going on underneath it in order to provide a proper judgment on that. And so I suppose I wondered, I guess my question was, is the level of detail, for example, if you look at the level of detail in terms of delivering the solutions here, is that what you are receiving from other PSBs around Wales? And whilst I appreciate quite what you say around not wishing any of these public bodies to jump to solutions without really unpicking what lies beneath these issues, which have been so prevalent in our communities for so many years. But equally, in order to say, yes, this gives us a framework to move forward. This gives us some very clear actions from which to measure progress then. I wondered what your reflection would be on that. And the second thing really was in terms of you were talking about Cwm Taf. Is that PSB now coterminous with, for example, the Health Board, Cwm Taf Health Board, and is that why it's chosen to do that? So I'll let you answer those two, and then I've got one other point. Thank you very much.
So in terms of, I absolutely recognise what you're saying in terms of, does this tell us exactly what we're going to do in relation to meeting the objectives? No, I don't think it does. That's not at odds with what we're seeing from the other draft wellbeing plans. In fact, some of them where they do give some quite specific things. In some ways, I'm slightly more worried about them because what I can see is that they've just been imported from the existing plans of the constituent organisations, or perhaps from the last single integrated plan. Does that mean that we wouldn't expect to be seeing a lot more detail in due course? Then no, I do think we need to be seeing a lot more detail, and you will be, as a scrutiny committee, you will be wanting to see a lot more detail. In terms of, so I have my duties are complex and slightly confused in legislation. So my duties are to advise public services boards on the setting of their plans, but not individual public bodies. But then to monitor and assess individual public bodies and not public service boards. You can see the way that doesn't quite work. So at the moment, what I'm looking at is our mechanisms for capturing the work of the public service boards through my duties to monitor and assess public bodies. I've set a number of priority areas for my own work, simply because the scope of the Act is so wide, I need to narrow it down. Those areas are adverse childhood experiences, social prescribing or alternative models of kind of health and well-being, and jobs and skills for the future. That's the more sort of people-orientated side of things, if you like. And then on infrastructure areas, so energy, housing and transport. So the approach that I'm developing at the moment is likely to be more of a deep dive into the actions throughout the system, individual public bodies and PSBs, into each of those areas in turn, rather than, because just to give you a flavour, of the 44 public bodies covered by the Act, there are 342 wellbeing objectives set. So I have, with a team of 20 people, I have no hope whatsoever of monitoring and assessing to the level you would need to, the extent to which those 342 objectives have been met. Hence why what I will be looking at in detail is in those kind of six priority areas. But I would expect you to be asking, and I don't know how you approach your, the agendas for your scrutiny committee, but, I don't see any reason why you wouldn't have a focus on, right, so we said that we would maximise opportunities for Monmouthshire as part of the city deal. What does that look like? We'll have a session on what you're actually doing there. We want the detail behind that, and we want to assess whether that's actually being done. So, okay. CUMTAF you asked about. CUMTAF, yes, it's the health board footprint as well, which is why it makes an awful lot of sense. They were brought together. The PSB there is chaired, well, it was chaired, but he's just retired, and I'm not sure whether they've agreed how they're moving forward. It was chaired by the Chief Constable of Police, which again is quite interesting because, of course, the police they are partners to the PSB, but they're not. They can't be mandated as sort of statutory partners. I don't have any concerns that I can refer to about the way in which Monmouthshire PSB is chaired, and in fact, I think of the local government family in Wales. Paul Matthews is very much on the the innovative side of things, as that we would want to see. However, some PSBs are, as I said, being run like another local authority committee, and those PSBs are not getting the best out of their members and are unlikely, I think, to be in the right place in terms of delivering their plans. CUMTAF, being chaired by the police, has brought a different perspective to those things. There are others who are chaired by the national parks or what have you, and I think they're what happens as to whether that's driving different types of behaviours in the PSB is something that we're keeping an eye on.
One more sort of, I suppose, as much a reflection as a question. In terms of the M4, obviously your office has given evidence to the public inquiry, and as I have myself, I live and represent a community which is greatly interested in how the M4 pans out. Mm-hmm. And I was interested to note, I think, that the response from the Welsh Government expert witnesses was that he didn't feel that your office's response reflected sustainable development, and that effectively the view given was wrong, was how he put it. Now, I suppose in your shoes, I would have probably found that relatively frustrating, to put it mildly. And I just wondered then where we reach a position like that, where your office is giving, providing evidence and so on and so forth to a statutory process which is going on there. What that looks and feels like from the perspective of your office. And it's interesting because Dimitri and I do disagree hugely on this. And in fact, we've had massive debates in this chamber and I'm sure that you could pick any manner of issues and discuss it. But the M4 is one which is interesting here, isn't it? Yeah. So,
I mean, his view's not surprising because ultimately he's, a government witness who is, finding ways to support the government's position. I have a different view. I imagine, we don't know what's going to happen, do we, as a result of the public inquiry. We need to wait to see what happens there. Depending on what happens there, you can imagine a situation where who's right and who's wrong is tested in the courts. But we're not at that, at that place yet. We've been doing a fair amount of work picking through what I would say are the holes in his response, and we're prepared to make those points.
Thank you very much. And I think if we could move on now to a question from Matt Gatehouse. Thank you very much. Did you want to come back, Sophie? I've got one question I'd like to ask. Obviously, it's very important that we get a buy-in from our residents. And I actually went to visit a resident yesterday who's just become chairman of our local Village Hall, which has been closed actually for 3 years, and we've got a new committee going. And she said to me, I didn't even know there was a community council. Now, what concerns me is, what marketing has been done and advertising nationally to promote the Wellbeing Act. And, I hate to say it, but I think if I went into my community and asked 10 people, they probably would think I was talking double Dutch. So do you have a marketing budget, and has there been national advertising to get the very important, input from our residents that we're looking for?
Unfortunately, the answer to the last question is no. Just to give you a bit of a flavour of the scale, so my budget is £1.4 million a year. To put that into some context, the Welsh Language Commissioner has a budget of around double that, with obviously, and I'm not questioning her budget whatsoever, but obviously the remit is much more narrowly defined. So, am I going to go and whinge to the government that I haven't got enough money? Well, I could do, but there's probably not much point in me doing that because there's no money coming from anywhere. The focus of my first 2 years has been on the 44 public bodies rather than kind of, the general public, if you like. But the approach to trying to reach the general public has been through various groups and organisations, and we're increasingly starting to see the general public, becoming aware of the Act and actually using the Act, which is really where we want to be. So you would imagine that we're often seeing that in planning type issues, where there's often like a campaign group which has been formed and the Act is being used. But can I envisage a situation where there's a really high profile, well funded kind of national campaign around the Act? Not at the moment, but we are working through various groups and organisations to try and get the message out there, but within the limits of the budget that I've got.
Thank you very much. I mean, I'm disappointed to hear that because obviously we've had a Welsh government for 20 years. The education and health of the country has actually deteriorated, and it is such an important piece of work, and it's going to take a complete culture change. So I'm sorry to hear that you've got such a small budget. Are there any other... But thank you for being so honest. Are there any other questions at all from the floor? Members? Well, can I just thank you, Sophie, so much for coming along and giving us your valuable time. It's been so worthwhile for all of us, and be absolutely sure that we're fully behind this wellbeing, and we certainly will be giving this very close scrutiny as members of this council. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anne, for your really insightful questions. Thank you.
Right, so thank you very much, members, and we will now be moving on to the draft wellbeing plan, which I think, if I can invite Matt down to present to the committee. Thank you. Well, this follows on very well from what we've just spent the last hour and a quarter discussing. So the floor's yours, Matt.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Hazel will be joining me again when she's shown the Commissioner out. Members, we were quite a few officers with us today because this is really quite a substantial undertaking and a very detailed piece of work. So it may be, depending on the question, I'll draw a couple of others into the response. So just to remind you of the context, we completed our wellbeing assessment during the summer. It was signed off and approved by Public Service Board and scrutinised by this committee. We had views expressed from the Future Generations Commissioner on that during the statutory consultation window. Following that, we used the wellbeing assessment to draft some proposed wellbeing objectives which, if memory serves me correctly, you looked at a very high level at the previous meeting. But this is the first opportunity you've had at a committee to look at the detail of the wellbeing assessment. There will be another opportunity before it's approved by PSB, but what I will say to that is only a sort of two and a half weeks prior to the next PSB meeting, at which we're hoping that they will approve the plan. You'll recall that we need to get this document approved within 1 year of the last ordinary council elections in May. So what we're hoping for is that from today's session, but also any feedback that you care to follow up with, either in writing or by means of conversation, we can really shape up this detail and finalise the plan based on your feedback today, your feedback over the coming weeks, and the remainder of the period of engagement that we have, which closes on the 7th of February, so that the next time you see the plan at your meeting in March, it is very close to a final document which you would be happy for the PSB to sign off. So, very conscious that the plan has been discussed today. We've got the 4 wellbeing objectives. This is the plan for the Public Service Board rather than the plan for Monmouthshire County Council. It is worth, as an aside, because obviously it is a very tightly aligned issue, just citing or reminding you that alongside this, Cabinet have instructed officers as well to prepare a corporate plan which draws on the same evidence base. So the Monmouthshire County Council corporate plan draws on a lot of this evidence. So some of these issues, which are incredibly important, have been surfaced by the evidence, been raised by people in our communities. Where those are predominantly a county council issue, you'll see them taken forward through the corporate plan rather than the wellbeing plan. So what we put before you today, 4 wellbeing objectives, which have been described, and a series of steps. Now, what we're open to today is particularly feedback on the plan itself, whether you feel on the basis of what you've seen it adequately covers the evidence base in the wellbeing assessment, whether the format and style of the plan is sufficiently clear to give you confidence that there's a coherent approach to unifying public services around that shared purpose of building sustainable and resilient communities. And as I say, whether those steps highlighted are the appropriate ones. So, Chair, if you're happy with that, I'll sort of pause there and invite questions and discussion.
Thank you very much indeed. So, if I can ask members if they have any questions for Matt following that presentation. Councillor Grocott.
Thank you, Chair. I think it was reassuring to hear the Commissioner say that, in her opinion, we're in the top quartile in terms of the nature of the plan. And I think we're all aware of the commitment that you and other officers have given towards getting where we are now. At the same time, in terms of my well-being, I think if I was a dementia patient in the south of Monmouthshire, I would not be feeling too cocky at the moment. And I'm going to say something which is controversial, which I hope might strengthen your arm in other places. Because I attended, as a member of this committee, an afternoon at Court Blevin of the Public Service Board, when there was an attempt to bring together key players from across the agencies represented. Natural Resources Wales were well represented, but I came away from that afternoon very firmly with the view that our Chief Executive, Deputy Chief Executive, yourself, other key officers from the County Council were there showing tremendous commitment to taking this all forward. When I looked at the representation from other key organisations, there was not that level of officer commitment. And as I say, a key area where health and social services should be coming together to operate a common service for elderly people with dementia. What we have actually seen within the last week is the County Council rejecting the views being put forward by the Health Authority, and yet having to do that almost as an objector to their plans rather than as two organisations working hand in glove to move things forward. And it worries me intensely that what we're actually seeing is something being driven with the best intentions in the world by the County Council and maybe other organisations like Natural Resources Wales, but that not all key players are on board. And as we get to the very close point that you just referred to, we're almost stepping over into a practical rolling out of this, that we have got key people whose vision does not encompass the things that the county's vision encompasses.
Thank you, Councillor Grocott. Would you like to come back, Matt?
Yes, thank you very much for the question, and I appreciate the background and sense of frustration that surfaced regarding the particular issue regarding mental health services, and I know that Claire got agreement to a response to the consultation at council, or is working towards that situation. Regarding the involvement of partners, I mean, we are very lucky in Monmouthshire in terms of the commitment of partners to the Public Service Board in general. I think we have that good degree of partnership working, and in terms, for the most part, of our joint working with colleagues and health, I can say with some confidence that I believe our arrangements were leading the way, and we have a lot of considerable and beneficial integrated working at the front line with our health services, things like the integrated teams that we have in our main towns where district nurses, social workers and therapists come together. What I would say around the Public Service Board is there are sort of two different angles to the health conversation. We've been incredibly fortunate with the level of engagement from some of our colleagues at Public Health Wales. You know, for example, with the work around the adverse childhood experiences and the degree of commitment that they've shown to their process. And when you think really around some of where this Act needs us to focus in terms of the preventative working, you know, understanding the evidence base around the sorts of decisions we can be taking to ensure we have a healthy population in future. We do have a lot of the really key people for us coming to the table, getting involved in these discussions and helping us shape the solutions. However, I do appreciate the point that you're making that that needs to exist at all levels of the NHS. So for the most part, operationally, we're in a great position. We're great with those relationships with Public Health Wales. Health is a complex organisation. What I would say is, as this select committee, obviously one of the things you can do is ask to scrutinise any of the partners who are part of the Public Service Board. So if you feel that you're not seeing as elected members the presence at that meeting, or you don't feel that degree of commitment that they have to the PSB is coming through, that's something you could choose to pick up as a committee here.
Thank you very much, Councillor Grocott.
Just to briefly come back on that, we are a committee of the County Council. I take your point that you made at the end of your comments there, that we scrutinise the PSB. Wouldn't it be better if there was actually a PSB-wide scrutiny committee rather than the scrutiny committee being the County Council scrutiny committee?
Well, I mean, this is, to a certain extent, the way in which the Act is structured, that the responsibility for the management of the PSB and the hosting of the committee sits with the local authority. But within your remit, and if you recall a few meetings back, I think we had members from different agencies come here and talk around their work and were scrutinised on the extent to which that contributes to the work of the PSB. So it is, you are able as a committee to invite broader members across the PSB, although it's hosted by and the scrutineers are members of the County Council. Your remit and your question can be far broader than just council services.
Thank you very much for that response. Are you happy with that? Yeah, and I think obviously we would welcome any suggestions from members of any particular public, services that they would like to see scrutinised at the committee when we discuss our forward work plan a little bit later. Councillor Petruni.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thanks, Matt. And I know you and many colleagues have done a tremendous amount of work on this, and you guys are really committed. And so my comments are just, you know what I'm like. I like to be a pain. But a few queries. One is, they're mostly technical. When it comes to when you're defining challenges and opportunities of the well-being, and you've put short-term, medium-term, and long-term, what are the actual timeframes do you apply? What makes short-term? What are you talking? And the only reason I ask that question is because you talked about limited public transport, particularly in rural areas. Of course, true. I will actually argue it's sort of true for in between the towns as well, and connections to the city. But one of the possible advances to help this is automated vehicles. Now, last time I checked the story on this, Google had driven theirs into a wall. So, what is your definition of short term and medium and long term? That would be very useful. I appreciate what you said in response to Councillor Taylor's point about definitive measures, and I just want a bit more reassurance, because I'm reading them and I'm just reading them off the cuff now, and they're just delivering the solution, tackling the causes of perpetual generational problems in families. Yeah, that's what we've been trying to do possibly for the last 150 years. I mean, there's no actual solution there, is there? That's just a statement of what we've been trying to do, and nothing has worked. For example, I'm not saying to do this for any moment of stretch of imagination, but the universal basic income on a local, hyper-local level as a possible, just those kind of new kind of ideas. You might think that's a nonsense and is a nonsense idea, maybe, but it's those kind of things that might help alleviate some of the problems we're facing here. Other than that, they're sort of saying, we're going to ensure schools and services for children focus on well-being, a more rounded approach. I hope we've been doing that for years. Do you know what I mean? Do you know what I'm trying to say? There's sort of what we either should have been doing or have been doing for 10 years or more, well more than that. What are we doing new? Sell it to me, Matt. Sell it.
I'll try my best. To pick up the first and I suppose slightly easier point, if there is an easy one amongst that, the short, medium and long term. What we try to do with this is it's not necessarily easy to determine, but potentially we felt the short term items were perhaps we might start to see an impact in 2 to 3 years. If we get cracking and get the right solutions in place around these, we could be looking at some sense of impact in that term. Medium term, we're sort of looking 5 years plus, and longer term, we're really looking at some of those generational issues, perhaps 10 years plus, when we start to see some impact if we were to get these right. So take the example of stressful and poor quality childhoods. If we were, let's say we had the perfect solution, which let's be clear we don't. If we had it, those 3, 4, 5-year-olds now, it's not really until they reach their teenage years and start to enter the labour market and have families that we understand whether that's been truly beneficial. Of course, there would be evaluation we'd undertake along the way, and we would hope to be able to demonstrate some progress. Whereas some of the shorter term things, for example, we've put in there the impact of volunteering and making more use of social capital. I hope members with their local authority hats on would acknowledge some of the positive work that's been happening through things like A County That Serves and the work of Owen Wills. So some of that we are starting to see the shoots of some positive impact there. We're not saying that's measurable improvements in outcomes yet, but actually if we continue with that path, we think potentially there are some changes in the short term. The question around the solutions is actually, I think this Act really does give us the opportunity. And what I was really encouraged to hear Sophie emphasise today, as her staff have to us throughout this process, because we do have a very good dialogue with her office, as she's not concerned that we don't have a smart action plan. For me, the worst thing in the world would be if someone said, you need a definite action plan right now, because it would force us to think we knew what the answers were. And if I sat before you today and said we know what the answers were, I would be lying, because these are these complex issues. The important thing I think this does is set out the biggest challenges and start to give us some sense of prioritisation around which of those challenges we're going to tackle and what some of the immediate steps may be. We don't necessarily know what those solutions are. So the important thing I think we have is the potential for culture change around this Act, starting to really get the right people to the table. And let's not pretend that, say, as a single public body, we know what the answers are to some of these problems. We need to make best use of the networks that we have, of the academics out there, of the global thought leaders, to try and bring some of the best solutions to the table. And, I think as a nation, we have an opportunity, because we're small enough within Wales to be able to take and get all of the local decision makers in one room, in a way that doesn't happen in larger nations. So potentially, if we have the right stuff, we're of a size that we can make it happen. We're also potentially of a size that's interesting enough as a very small nation that we could get the big players to the table to work with us, to test things out on the scale of a small nation, to develop some of these things that could be the global solutions. And through the potential for that is work with the likes of Cardiff University and a lab to see which of these players who have the solutions we could come to get and pilot them in our corner of southeast Wales. So we don't have the answers. What we're trying to set in place is an environment where we can start to solve some of those really critical problems.
Thank you. Councillor Petruni, would you like to come back, and then I'll take Councillor Taylor.
All solutions is this assessment of the issues, but surely we knew the intergenerational is not a new. Do you know what I mean? It's not new. So it just feels like we sort of, not all the issues in the community, but the big ones, we sort of know that already. We knew that. You guys at Frontline knew that pretty much already. I just feel like, I don't know, feels a bit slow, and we're going through this again, and we're assessing the same old problems, and we know the same old problems, and then we're doing it, we're saying it, stating them again. But eventually we're going to have to pick a solution, aren't we? We're going to have to at least assess some of them, because some will have downsides. There is, as you say, there is no perfect solution. Eventually we're going to have a suite of solutions that are more effective in areas than others. And I'm just, when do we get that? When do we even get the, right, this is a possible solution, guys, and then Councillor Pratt and I can have a row about it, and but at least we're getting a solution about it. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Something meaty, rather than there's intergenerational problems. Yes, thank you for that. Yes, anyone involved in elected office knows that. And the other one, I just really more specific, is time banking. And I think it's a very good idea, and I'm totally supportive of it. But my only little bugbear and question about this is, how do we make sure, time banking is great, for example, if you're retired or you're financially well enough, better off to just not work and not be dominated by all those pressures. How do we make sure the people who are swamped with work or childcare commitments or caring commitments and just so much time pressure, how do we make sure they benefit from such a system? Otherwise they'll be left out of that kind of system.
Thank you for those questions. If you'd like to come back, and then I'll take Councillor Taylor's.
Okay, thanks. So to pick up on the first one, I think when we may have a solution of these is going to vary with each of them. So take for issue that issue of intergenerational poverty. And I know you and I have read some of the same books on around this, because you've recommended some of them to me. My bookshelf is collapsing under the weight of Thomas Piketty's Capital, and it's 1,000 or so pages in hardback. But things like the work on adverse childhood experiences, actually Sophie is hosting an ACES team within the Future Generations Commissioner's Office. So actually we do, from the research that Public Health Wales have done, and I forget which academic institution they worked with. So we have far more knowledge now around some of that work than we had on this 2 years ago. And from that knowledge around where the issues are, potentially we're starting to move a little more to understanding where those solutions may come from. And I don't have the detail on where they're at today, but I have been working down in their office where the ACE Hub have been inviting people in and have been doing all of their cause analysis on those issues. So we are starting to see some of these solutions emerge. And I know, for example, I mentioned earlier the notion of rural transport. I think very soon, inside 12 months, we'll start to see some pilots emerge that could start to impact in Monmouthshire, that would have applicability across the whole of Wales, but which potentially we could see piloted within our county. But it will be very different. But what I would say is some of these are already underway through things like active citizenship and a different approach to social care. You see the work done by the likes of Nikki Needle and Julie Boothroyd in adult social care that have really started to transform that model away from one of transaction and task to one where we really start to see more productive relationships develop. There have been positive impacts on the staff. So some of these are underway, and they'll take a long time for the full impact to be realised. Some we're still very much at the learning stage. And then just very briefly on the time back one, absolutely, it's a difficult issue for us. And also I think with all sort of volunteering, it's one of these areas where potentially we stand to benefit quite a bit in terms of Monmouthshire with the amount of social capital that we have here. We know that not everyone is necessarily able to contribute or put into that in the same way. And there are different ways in which you can run time banking, but potentially a lot of the people that give their time are not necessarily doing it to earn credit. So if we do go forward down this route, there's a lot of people that volunteer and would say, for example, earn credits, but don't necessarily spend those credits on themselves. So what a lot of schemes do is enable you to put those into a community pot that can then be distributed around other causes in the community, which would benefit people who themselves may not be able to contribute. But hopefully, there are different points in our lives, and some points in our lives, some of us are able to contribute more, and at other points we're able to contribute less. This gives the potential for an evening out across time and across society. At any point in time, absolutely, you're right. But what we'd hope, if we go forward with a scheme like this and get it right, there's potential to iron those out. And certainly I know the research from the Spice Time Bank, which started here in Wales and is now running all over the UK, is that a huge amount more time was put into the system in terms of volunteering that was taken out. So actually, I have time credits that I've earned in working in my local children's school. I've never spent them. They're pinned to the notice board. I doubt I ever will spend them in their physical ones. And one day we'll actually get them off the notice board and give them to someone that needs them. But it's that sense. I will never spend those as time credits. But actually, we got involved because it was something that was just beneficial to the community and was good fun for us.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Taylor.
Right, just going to vent a slight bit of frustration here, because actually I don't think what we're describing is that we don't have the answers. I think what we're describing is we just don't have the capability, capacity and will in our public services to enact them. So for example, I could go back 20 years and talk about, time banking, which, in Ferndale and with Valley's kids, that they were doing very successfully. And then, like happens all the time, you know, there's a cycle. Something's popular for a while and then it drops off the agenda. There's money invested into something for a while and then it drops off the agenda. And that's happened for longer than 20 years. I'm talking about my own, you know, experience of working life. And that'll have happened in whatever public service you can potentially find, whether we're talking about, you know, there's a lot of work, you know, it's not rocket science to know that loneliness makes people sad, makes people ill. And, you know, we're talking about sort of investing in connecting people. And that's not really a hard thing to do either. But we seem to have great difficulty in doing sort of things that aren't hard and don't necessarily cost that much because it involves completely different ways of working. That said, if we talk about adverse childhood experiences, haven't we known forever that, you know, children who are in households that experience domestic abuse, you know, have parents in prison, you know, will do worse, will, you know, eventually probably end up in cyclical behaviours. Haven't we known that for a really, really long time? I'm not saying it isn't good to see that it isn't starting to be taken seriously and there isn't activity and there isn't research that gives us empirical evidence which is persuasive. But then who's it persuasive for? Persuasive for the people with budgets who, you know, we're trying to persuade to spend on some of these things in the main, I think. But, you know, I can go back, it is nearly 20 years to when I was, you know, working, developing nurture provision in Dufferin Infant and Junior School, which basically provides that support for children who may be experiencing long-term difficulties in their household, but actually also short-term things, like, for example, if there's a bereavement in the household. I suppose what I'm saying, Matt, is my frustration is that many of the issues that are identified have had, over time, good quality investment in them, will have produced evidence that they work, but for a variety of reasons usually become disinvested in, and therefore, because they do not produce immediate results. So, for example, if you were to support children and young people who were experiencing adverse childhood experiences, it would not demonstrate any outcome for quite some time, because you wouldn't know if you were being effective and if you were supporting those young people to lead, you know, potentially more productive lives for quite some time. So that's a frustration of mine. In here, again, I guess the point that Councillor Batruni makes is a point well made, because whilst we may be able to do something around what I would call personal and social manifestations of difficulty, the structural barriers, the way that our systems work, you've mentioned universal income, so, you know, the way our benefit systems work, the way our education systems work, I don't necessarily see how this work is going to address those, some of which are devolved issues, some of which are not devolved issues, and I suppose that's my frustration. So when I look at the plan, I see some you know, very worthy stuff. Who would argue against investing in supporting the best start in life for children? And I look forward to seeing what comes out of that. But I do think, to a certain extent, that what we're not doing is asking the right people often. You know, so when I went to that workshop, you were there, weren't you? And I think the comments are there. We didn't go through the minutes, Chair, because Sophie was here, but it says that there was a top loading of Monmouthshire affairs. I think that meant to read officers under item 7, because it was absolute. I counted how many there were. I can't remember how many there were, but there was a lot, and there weren't similar. You know, and it was. You know, there were lots of people that I expected to see there. There were people I would have expected to see there that weren't there. And there was people that were there that I wouldn't have necessarily expected to see there. But there was more usual suspects than unusual suspects, to be fair. So I just wonder to a certain extent, and you know, if we were to go through this and scrutinise this, does this give us a framework to hang our work on? For me, I'm not sure that you know, that it does yet. And if that's what we're looking for, then I don't think this gives it to us yet. And whilst I do take your point, you know, for some of them, we can't just say, well, but actually we could say this is what we were going to do about it if we had the buy-in of all the relevant agencies. So, for example, if we had massive buy-in from midwifery, you know, but actually I suspect that we're not just not there yet. That's why we can't articulate what our plan looks like. Rather than do we not know what to do. And I don't, you know, and I'm not being glib, I do appreciate that there will be some areas that will require much more knowledge and you know, more research. I've been part of the strategic transport group for 6 years. No one was interested in that in the council initially. In fact, you know, we don't have people banging the door down to come to it now. But actually, it's really important and it's critical in here because people need to be able to get around. And if it's a sustainable solution, they need better than hourly buses. But frankly, the problem with that is we've got a privatised bus system. Yeah. And we don't have any influence over it because we can't. So how do we deal with that? You know, do you know what I mean? That's a structural issue. How do we deal with those structural issues? I don't see any analysis of that in here, and I would have expected to if we were going to, you know, really address it. Anyway, I could go on all day, probably, Matt, as you know, and I won't do that. But I suppose I read through this, and I know that there's a huge amount of work being invested in, and I know I'm not trying to be critical of that. I just think there's a frustration from you know, especially if you've worked in the areas that are included in here, which are around, you know, I mean, Sophie used the term social prescribing. Well, even that actually, and sorry, your analysis of time banking, for anything to really work and be of value to people, it has to be reciprocal. People can't feel like they're getting something for nothing because that's not what people want. They may not have anything, you know, might not have, you know, financial investment, but people can give other things and people have to feel that that's worthwhile. And that's usually where public service make their big mistakes when they're trying to work with communities. And the other side, I do agree with Councillor Pratt's analysis of, you know, to what extent is there an understanding or buy-in in our wider community? And maybe we can't expect that yet. But it is vital if this is to have any traction. In fact, I read Paul Matthews' blurb at the front. This is a call to action, you know. Well, a call to action for what? To do what? You know, and unless we're clear about that, we're not going to get anywhere, are we? So, yeah, there's a bit of work to do, I think. And I think our frustration is, from a county council point, I mean, you know, look, I don't know, if we were to rack up how much investment we're making in this day in, day out, it's quite significant. Yeah. And I think we need to understand and see, and we've said this previously, what that looks like and how that really works in terms of the collaboration, integration and cross-cutting stuff across the piece. And also, why haven't we got a Gwent-wide PSB yet? In fact, I'll leave you that question.
Thank you very much. Are you clear, Matt, as to what the questions are? Yeah. Thank you, Councillor Taylor. If you'd like to come back.
I'll come back on some of those. I may not cover all of those. I hope you'll understand. If there are any particular points I missed, but in all seriousness, I mean to pick up on your first point around capacity, capability, and will. Do we have the will to do this? Yes, absolutely. I mean, these are our communities. This is our future.
And when I say we, sorry, are we talking we or we? Are we talking across the public service?
Yes, and I think to it, you know, the answer to that is yes. I mean, you know, we do have incredibly good buying. We do across the whole of the PSB. You know, I think we do have that attendance at senior level from all of the organisations. This though is a big journey, but I do accept and recognise the point. But yeah, absolutely, we have the will to make a difference, and a lot of that is about the evidence. You're right in terms of what you say, that a lot of these issues have been around for a while. What we haven't always been very good at in public services, and we're not there yet, is really an evidence-based understanding, because it's the evidence base that even when things do work then, that gives the knowledge and the confidence to others that they will work beyond the locality where they existed. I mean, that's often said. It's an often said statement that good practice doesn't travel.
Yes.
And actually that's often because good practice isn't replicable. You know, we don't put that evidence base in there. So that working with the academics, I think, is really important. And we've seen that now with the ACES work. Do we have the capability? Yeah, I believe in a lot of cases we do. In some areas we don't. And that's where we need to draw in those experts from outside and those externals. But you know, as I look around the officers I work with and the partners we work with and other public sector bodies, I'm really encouraged by the capability and enthusiasm that we have. Capacity, well, in an ideal world with a few more pounds in the bank, we would all wish for a little more capacity. And yes, there are a lot of people involved in this work, but there are not a lot of people involved full time. It's people getting hours here and there on top of their existing jobs. So, you know, the officers in here today, no one works full time on this. No new jobs were created after the Public Service Board was created. What we're doing is managing and prioritising within the resources that we have. In terms of the immediacy of results, yeah, you're absolutely right. They won't be immediate, and I think that's the really important coverage we get by this Act. The ability to say, unlike sort of other bits of legislation that place a duty to improve over a period of time, and show, you know, effectively has come back to committee as officers and try to show measurable improvements in processes quarter by quarter. This really is about saying, if we get this right, we're not going to see the improvement over the longer term. But that is a very difficult one for politicians at all levels, you know, to say, actually, we're going to invest in this, but the return from it is not going to exist within the current political term. And that's a very difficult one for anyone to make a decision on, be they an officer or a member, to say, this is what I'm going to put my time in, but you're not going to see a benefit from this while I'm in this job. It'll be after I've left. And I suppose in terms of the, you know, is this it? I suppose I suppose I might sort of turn the question back to a little to members and think, well, if this plan as is doesn't quite give you enough confidence yet, what more would you expect to do to it to give it that confidence? You know, because we're here for a discussion and to use your feedback to improve what we're doing. So actually, if you're saying, I would have more confidence if you included this, or if you included a little more detail on, you know, we're very open to that, because we're here for this dialogue and to get that scrutiny of the plan.
So just to come back, I think for me, if we did have some, if we did show where those structural barriers were going to be tackled as part of the plan, I think that would give me a bit more confidence. Additionally, take Councillor Dimitri's point earlier around the performance throughout our schools. I mean, I actually think that if you differentiate between the teacher assessment and then the external assessment, actually I think you begin to see, be interesting to see if you track that through the national tests, what that looks like now in the primary schools. And I think that, for example, if we understand that we do quite well at primary school in terms of turning out, you know, whatever the expected levels are, but that doesn't necessarily translate in secondary school, I think an understanding of that, and therefore what are we going to do to make sure that we're supporting our young people in that bit where we talk about giving them the best start, because it may not be academic support that we need to provide, and I think we need to understand that. But also, for example, and this is very close to home, if we take our adverse childhood experiences and we recognise that the children that we're responsible for, that we're corporate parents for, have probably experienced many of those issues, sadly, but we still can't provide them with work experience. I think if we can't address that consistently, and we're not really supporting them to achieve whatever it is that they want to achieve, then I think we're onto a bit of a loser before we start looking at children outside of that. Because if those children, which are a small cohort, small numbers of children, if we can't support them to have the best start in life, then it's a pretty poor prescription for us intervening and interfering in other children outside of our care. Are you with me? So I'd really like to I suppose for me, see what that looks like in real terms, within our own gift. What are we doing differently as a result of our better understanding of this work in our own practical council delivery.
Thank you. Did you want to come back to that? And then we'll... Councillor Petrucci.
For me, really quickly, Chair, it's just having to sing more concrete, more substantive. For example, look at the inequality gap we have at GCSE results. Okay? I'm just picking this as an example. I'm not saying you do this, but 44% is the current gap, I got told. It was previously 41, now we're going up to 44. So there's an inequality gap at GCSEs, and you know as well as I do, if you're coming out with poor GCSEs in this current climate for a young person, you're in trouble. Life is going to be super tough. And so that's a concrete issue we know is a problem. We know it's endemic. We know we already have the data telling us it's been an endemic in Monmouthshire 3-4 years down the line. Right, what's out there? I'm just even case studies. I'm not saying do this for everything you've highlighted here, but just even a case study of here's identifiable problem in Monmouthshire. So as a long-term trend, look at this. Right, what are we've had a quick glance of what's available to solve this problem. Look at option A, look at option B, what option C. Are any of these doable? Just moving beyond, look at all the challenges we face and just starting to look at the solutions would start to satisfy me personally. I'm only speaking for myself. Because I look further on what happens next. Further work needs to be developed. First bullet point, exploring further the root causes of issues and challenges. Yes, I'm not saying don't do that, but come on. We know we have lots of indicators telling us there's lots of problems in certain areas. Let's pick one or two, maybe a pilot, for example, and say, look, this is an issue. We all agree politically this is an issue. We want it addressed. Here's some options. And then the politics come in. Then we can have a debate, but then it's meaning something. And then all of us can get our teeth into it. And then officers, you can see, and then a decision will eventually be made of which solution we pick. And let's see if it works. Do you know what I mean? That kind of, right, there we go. Let's see what we can do. Let's have the argument. Let's get it going. That makes any sense.
Thank you very much. And there's quite a few points there. And I wonder if you can also, within that, because Councillor Petrucci mentioned the indicators, and we heard the Commissioner say 46 indicators were too many. Would you like to also comment on that as part of your response?
Sure. I think, thank you, Councillor Taylor, initially to pick up on that, some helpful thoughts in there, actually, in terms of some of the issues. It is generally something we grappled with. Do we put case studies in there? Do we start to put a little more detail? But what I'd say is,
and with the transport stuff as well.
Yeah.
In terms of.
It sounds like it's more advanced from what you've just said. It sounds more advanced than it's on this than in this. You said 12 months. There was some. I remember maybe misremembering you, but you said 12 months, and it doesn't seem to be telling us that. It says short-term automated vehicles. Tell us. It starts satisfying me that, we're actually seeing some concrete stuff coming down the line.
Yeah, so I think the one thing, what I'm not sure is how much more we can put in the plan. I think actually I have heard some things that we can do to give it a flavour, and one of is to give that sense of the possible.
Yeah.
And to bring it to life a little more, to bring a sense that this is going to be different, and here are some of the reasons, because these are the sorts of things it could be. What I would say is we are developing work alongside this that we will bring to the committee. What we didn't want to do was put it in the plan at a very sort of early and rough stage. And Sharon may want to come in on this as well, but I mentioned briefly earlier, the programme board were looking at this. So we will have in place the groups that look at this. And what we think it was actually, if that programme board looks at it, what we can give you as a committee is that work. So these are the action plans, and you can look at those and decide which of these you want to scrutinise in some detail as we go forward with this plan. Because what we don't want to do is say this is the plan and that's it. What we want to do is say this is the plan and these we think are the right areas. If we can get an agreement to these being the right areas through this wave of consultation, then that gives us the confidence as officers and to work with our partners to really drill down and put some energy into these and work them up in more detailed proposals for you to scrutinise. I think what we're a little concerned around is with these 4 objectives, 4 to 5 steps in each one. That's 16 things in the timescales that we have. And sorry.
Do you know what I mean? Just pick 2 and give a flavour. I obviously understand you can't pick all of them. That'd be totally unreasonable. But just like 1 or 2, I think it moves on from Councillor Pratt's point, which is 46 is too many. And Sophie's house. So let's talk about 5. Okay, let's talk about 5. Let's start talking about solutions to those possible 5, or and what's actually doable and what's not actually doable. And then, yes, are those 5 going to solve all the problems we face? No, but at least we're starting somewhere. And then you maybe build momentum. Okay, we're dealing with these now. Let's move it to 7. Let's move it to 8. Do you know what I mean? Like 46 national indicators, all these problems. Let's start somewhere. That makes sense.
Thank you. I think we need to wrap this up fairly shortly, but if you'd like to come back on that point, Matt.
Very quickly. I think we can look at doing that and give a bit of a flavour and incorporate that in the final version of this. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, members, and Matt, for that discussion. I think that, obviously we've got a lot of experience and expertise here amongst members, and it's been, I think, a very good session. What's clear is we have to make a start somewhere with this, and I think it's going to be a long-term. I mean, I see this as a 25-year strategy, this well-being. It's really a long-term thing, and it's going to take a change of culture and mindset. But I think, as members have said, we need to keep this as simple as we can. And I think we've got to really steer away from this very academic discussion, which will go over a lot of people's heads, including our own residents. And I think we need to have clear indicators. We need clear ways of measuring our effectiveness, and we have to make sure that this is an efficient process. As members have said today, this is taking up a lot of time. When you think of the cost of the Public Service Board and bringing all those people together, we have to make sure that we're making inroads, and that we are actually making a difference as quickly as we can. So thank you very much indeed. And would members like a comfort break before we move on to the next item, or are you happy to plough on? Okay, fine. Thank you very much indeed, Matt.
Sorry, Chair, I do have to go shortly. My mum's in hospital in Swansea, so I'm heading straight down there. So I will indicate to you when I need to go.
Okay, if you want to leave any burning questions with Councillor Petrini, I'm sure he'll ask them on your behalf. So we're now going to move on to the wellbeing engagement and measuring wellbeing at a community level. Obviously, we have had some references to this particular aspect of the Wellbeing Act this morning. And we've got Rhiann Cook and Abby Barton with us today. Is that correct? Oh, Sian, I do apologise. So Sian Schofield and Rhiann Cook, who are with us, and they're going to present item number 7. Would if somebody would like to sort that out, and then if one of you could actually present. Could you just start by telling members a little bit about what you're going to talk about? Thank you.
Hi, my name's Rhiannon Cook. I work in the engagement and communications team. I've been working with the data team with Matt and Sian and Hazel to work on the engagement process for the Wellbeing Plan consultation. The engagement process started in November 2017, and the 12-week consultation will end on the 7th of February. The main aim of the engagement process was to gain thoughts and ideas, and to inform the actions and objectives within the Wellbeing Plan. So following our extensive bout of consultation that took place in 2016, this was kind of a sort of a streamlined engagement process. It wasn't as extensive as the one that took place in 2016, but we did reach out to some similar groups that we'd already talked to. We talked to town and community councils. We were out and about talking to our local residents. So we did a lot of work in our local hubs. We went to talk to community groups and individuals that are in the hubs. Staff were also engaged via sort of online surveys, all staff emails, and our internal intranet, the hub. And also PSB partnership groups and subgroups were also engaged, not by myself, but by officers that are working quite closely with the groups. So our partnerships team did a lot of work with town and community councils. They did a lot of work with our PSB subgroups as well. So it was really tailoring the engagement to the people who those people trust and were able to get the most information out of. As I said, I just did a lot of face-to-face stuff in the community and just worked on the stuff we did last year. So we worked on exactly the same process. We used an online survey. The survey were asking people whether they agreed or disagreed with each of the objectives. They were also open boxes for people to supply ideas about if there was anything that they think that we could do to work on the actions within the objectives. But I think also more discussions took place around sort of specialised groups. So in regards to each of the objectives, say the climate change group were sort of talked a little bit more about sort of objective 4 about the environment, and also sort of the early years group were talked to and asked for ideas about sort of objective 1 about the early years. So following the event that took place in sort of September, when all the objectives were kind of brought together, a plan on a page was designed by Fran O'Hara, who's a sort of evaluation artist. So the plan on the page was a really big hit with our residents, and it provided a concise, interesting visual representation of the wellbeing plan. So they didn't have to scroll through pages and pages of the plan. It was something that, you know, residents could have a quick look at, gain a really nice flavour of what's going on, but also we enhanced it with just chatting to them and putting in sort of plain English about what we're trying to do. So we didn't baffle them with science. We really, you know, talked to them about what they can do and what we're trying to do for our future generations in Monmouthshire. As I said, it was very useful for social media as well, and we had the plans, you've probably seen them printed on big A1 boards, which created a lot of attention when we was out and about in the community. So it intrigued people, and people were also able to take away a sheet of plan on the page with them if they wanted to share it with friends and community groups that they were working with. There's also a chance for them to then feedback via the online survey. But we also went out, when we were out and about, we took tablets and laptops with us, so people were able to have a chat with us about, you know, the survey, and we were trying to do it for them. So it wasn't an onerous process. We were just trying to make it as easy as possible for people to feedback on how they feel about the plan. So to date, we've had mainly positive responses to the survey, and the majority of discussions that have took place with the various groups and individuals have all sort of agreed with the objectives. They are keen to find out what is happening to implement the objectives and the actions. And this is something, obviously, as we've talked about all morning, there's something that's going to come out in future months with the action plan. And I think perhaps some work will happen if there's an action plan in place and we've got definite things that's happening, to just go back out and talk to people that we've sort of, dropped in on in the past, just to tell them what is actually happening, just to keep them in the picture, because feedback is vital in the engagement process. So today, discussions have taken place with town and community councils, community groups such as Transition Monmouth, Brunacombe area committees. On Friday, the Access for All forum took place, which is called Talk to Us, an engagement forum. So basing it on the premise of previous meetings, that Penny Walker, a lady who was brought in to work with hard to reach groups, she is not in place at the moment due to funding. So we try to replicate the meeting because it's such a valuable opportunity for groups such as 50 plus groups, people first groups, which is people with learning disabilities, to come together. The meeting took place on Friday, and people were informed about the wellbeing plan. They were also informed about the budget, two key areas that we've got going on at the moment that we'd like to talk to people and gain views on. So there's also a young people's event that's taking place on Thursday. There's going to be a big workshop about the wellbeing plan and the objectives within it. That's taking place on Thursday at the Caldicott Choir Hall. And we're working closely with the youth service to do some interactive workshops, some fun ways of getting ideas about how young people feel about the objectives. So if you did want to pop down for that, please feel free. It's 10 till 2 on Thursday. I'll just hand you over to Sian now, my colleague. She's going to talk to you a little bit about the Happiness Pulse survey that we've already mentioned this morning. And Sian will give you a lowdown on what it's all about and what we'd like to gain out of it.
Thank you. So one area we're currently engaging in is the Happiness Pulse, which was commissioned by the 5 Gwent PSBs as a pilot project across the 5. It came out of GSWAG as an initial idea. So the idea is to get a better understanding of the well-being of the populations across Gwent. It's an online survey that creates an individual well-being score in 3 areas, which are B, which is how you feel about yourself and your life, do what you do in your day-to-day life that contributes to your well-being, and connect, which is all about your relationships with other people and your community. So the idea is it enables people to understand how to improve their own well-being by providing tips on those 3 different areas. We have a short video clip here, which I'll aim to play for you.
I'll just talk you through a little bit about the campaign that was launched on the 15th of January. So I don't know whether you know that 15th January was Blue Monday, the day most known as the most depressing day of the year following Christmas and, go back to work and everything. So we launched it on the 15th of January in all our local hubs. They were holding Beat the Blues events across sort of Abergavenny, Usk. There was lots of things going on. So colleagues were out and about in our local hubs, talking to people as they were finding out, trying something new, beating the blues, and taking the Happiness Pulse survey for themselves. The day went really well. We had quite a lot of people taking it, and just really learned things from the day, sort of sitting down with somebody that needed help, finding out, you find a lot of things out from just taking the survey yourself, let alone sitting down and talking to community residents. There are sort of things that are coming out of it that you don't really find when you're taking it yourself. We did it at the Access for All Forum Friday, and there's a gentleman at the end whose wife had just died, and the loneliness question is really pertinent, and it's just sort of dealing with that when you're going through the survey. But it does make people think, and it's not in any way there to make you feel depressed. It's really just about empowering you, and then really just finding out if there's anything that you can do to sort of improve your connections, or find a community group, or try some volunteering and try something new. So the campaign was launched on the 15th. There's an ongoing campaign throughout January and February, tying in with Beating the Blues this January. And we'll be just promoting the survey via our own social media, so online. So also we've done all staff emails. If you haven't done it already, please do it. Please share it with your friends. It doesn't matter that you don't live in Monmouthshire. It's Gwent wide. Please. So we'll be just doing that throughout January. So please share alike.
Thanks. So, as we said, the Pulse is now available until the end of February. After the big launch last Monday, so far we've had over 160 residents and almost 300 staff responses collected so far. What we would like to do is use the results to compare wellbeing in Monmouthshire with Gwent areas, and we could also use the Pulse data to inform local decision making. So as Rhian said, we'd really encourage, if you haven't already, to please take the Pulse. Please share. As you see our links coming out on social media, please share and encourage anyone in your communities to take the Pulse as well. If there are any events going on that it would be useful if we attended to further promote, please do let us know. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So that was a very interesting presentation, and we'll take questions now from members. Councillor Grocott.
It's more of a comment, really, Chair. I'm glad you had a positive response when you were out in the hub and talking to people, but it's not surprising. Because if you said to people, for example, take the first one of the four areas, give every child the best start in life, would you support the PSB in giving every child the best start in life? Well, of course you're going to say yes. But what that actually then means in practice is if you're a child in a school and you have a problem, then it takes the school some time to identify that, because the school's budget has been cut and they can only afford half an hour a term of an education psychologist's time. So the education psychologist eventually comes and says, you need to see CAMHS. So they go on the list to see CAMHS, and CAMHS has had cuts, and so it's a year before you can see a psychiatrist. That psychiatrist report says the child needs a statement. There is then a problem because we don't meet our deadlines in terms of the statutory limits to get statements out. When you actually drill down, we've got very real problems in delivering these things that everybody says are great. And I just worry that the public will start to find out about the work of the PSB that we've been talking about this morning, the work in delivering the goals which everybody would agree with. But I do fear that the resources are simply not there with the best will in the world. And that's not the fault of anybody here. It's the fault of 5 years or more of austerity.
Thank you, Councillor Grocott. So would would Abby or Ian like to respond to Councillor Grocut's comments? Or Matt?
Sorry. No. I think those are fair challenges. We know that what we set out here is ambitious, and it's a fair comment to say. But what we're trying to do at this stage is to get that broad sense of agreement. So then, when we come back with more detailed proposals around each of these, we can say, well, actually, this is aligned to the priorities. But as important with that, I think, is then what it says about some of the decisions we don't take. When actually there are proposals for projects that don't contribute to these objectives and won't be maximising their impact on the wellbeing goals. We all know there isn't enough resource to deliver the gold-plated service in every single area we would like. So this, to a certain extent, is an exercise in prioritisation. If we can get this broad agreement to these higher level objectives, then it gives us the right framework for decision making from this point forward. But absolutely, and do understand what you're saying in terms of the point and the detail of that. Clearly, some of that detail may be one for Children and Young People Select Committee in terms of the actual impact.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from members? Councillor Petruni.
Really quick one. Are we putting the pulse, is it a live system in the sense that is it measured every day, every hour, every minute? I know San Francisco, is it San Francisco or Boston? One of them have a happy index. Have I just made that up? Or have I read that some... San Francisco. It was San Fran, or both of them, yeah, there we go. They have a live version of this. Is that what we're doing, or if not, is that what we're planning to do?
I can perhaps fill in some around that. So as people fill in the questionnaire, I see the responses come back, as in I see another response has been collected. At the moment, that overview data is quite limited, so it tells us a little bit about the gender of the person, the age group, and that sort of information. So it is live in the sense that it's being collected and updated automatically. Yeah.
Did you want to come back at all, Councillor Petruni?
Is that publicly available?
No, at the moment that's available to admin logins. But I think when we get to the point where we have, at the end of February, where we have enough data, it will be produced and analysed and available publicly at that point. Not the live, sorry, the retrospective look back, yeah.
I know Councillor Taylor has to leave shortly. Are there any questions you'd like to ask before you go? Okay, fine. If I can just ask, I mean, obviously I'm really... it's very encouraging to hear the work that you're doing, because as I said earlier on, it's really important that we get our residents engaged and that they know where to go for help and how to improve their lives. Have you got any idea of numbers of how many people you've engaged with since you've been doing the consultation in 2016, or as a percentage of the number of residents we have? Do you know how many people you've engaged with?
In 2016, there was over 1,400 people that we engaged with. As I sort of said, it wasn't on the grand scale of that when we did our engagement this second time. I would have said sort of over 100, 150 to date, just because of capacity. And also, it was a different way of working. It wasn't a complete blanket approach. It was quite targeted towards sort of some of the main groups that could contribute to, to informing about the actions. But also some face-to-face stuff in our hubs, and that's hit or miss sometimes, however busy they are. So, but yeah, so.
Thank you very much indeed for answering that. So, members, does anybody else want to make any further contributions to this part of our programme? No? Well, can I just thank you very much for coming along today and presenting to us. And obviously, I think this is work in progress, and we shall be working together closely and watching as this progresses. Thank you.
I bet you all score.
Okay, fine. So I think we will go back to, we'll consider the Select Committee's Forward Work Programme next, and then we'll go back and obviously cover the minutes of the previous meeting. We've already had some indicators from members that they'd like to see things on the Forward Work Programme, but if we have a look at what's on there at the moment, and in fact, I think it was discussed at our pre-meeting that we are concerned at the lack of strategy and the lack of items that we've got moving forward for the Public Service Board. So I think what we really felt was that we wanted to see a lot more meat on the bones, and we'd like to see the Public Service Board coming forward with some strategies and some ideas for further scrutiny, because obviously how can we scrutinise when we have no idea what their programme is? So I think, would you be the person to take that back, Matt?
Yes, if myself and Sharon will pick that up out of the meeting, take a look at the upcoming items. In reality, what's been happening over the past couple of Public Service Board meetings, it's been very much dominated by the wellbeing assessment and the wellbeing plan. They've received a number of other items, but often some of those can tend to be operational as well, such as sort of discharging their responsibilities around things such as domestic homicide reviews, which are not necessarily, well, they're not things which get placed in the public domain. So it has been a mix of that very operational business and this. But I think we're now entering a phase, once we have this wellbeing plan close to final, where the work programme of the Public Services Board will change considerably, and they'll start to receive far more reports around the detail of what you see here and how that strategy is being implemented. So what we'll do, we'll come back ahead of the next meeting with an outline of the work programme for the next year, and you can then decide how you wish to programme that activity.
Thank you very much. That would be extremely helpful. Are members happy with that? Yeah. Okay. And as if members feel strongly that they'd like any particular bodies to come along to this committee, obviously if they could liaise with Paula with those ideas, that would be extremely helpful. As what we don't want is for it to turn into a talking shop and for there not to be any action. So we'll now take the minutes of the previous meeting, which was held on the 18th of October. So are we okay? So I'm happy. So we'll move those minutes, and I'll sign those as a true record. And the final thing that we need to do is to note the date and time of the next meeting, which is going to be the 21st of March. So we look forward to seeing everybody then, and there will be a pre-meeting at 9:30. But can I thank everybody, officers and members, for their valuable contributions this morning. Thank you very much. The meeting is now closed.